ever have one of those weeks where you just crave junk food? You know those ones where you can't stop yourself?
Oh, tell me about it.
Well, it turns out there's actually some pretty compelling evidence suggesting that it's not just our taste buds driving those cravings.
Yeah.
We're actually diving deep today into a recent study that sheds light on just how significantly junk food can impact our brains,
Right.
specifically how it affects the brain's sensitivity to insulin.
Okay.
And we're talking even in the short term.
Interesting.
So this study was published in Nature Metabolism, and it was also featured in Neuroscience News back in February.
Okay.
The title of the article is pretty striking. It's called Short-Term Junk Food Diet Reduces Brain's Insulin Sensitivity.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement right there.
Yeah, so this study, when you think about the negative effects of junk food,
Right.
we tend to think about it as something that unfolds, over years and years.
Yeah, the long-term consequences, the
Right.
kind of stuff that creeps up on you.
Exactly. But this study found that just 5 days.
5 days.
5 days
Wow.
of a high-calorie, highly processed diet
Okay.
was actually enough to reduce insulin sensitivity in the brains of healthy men.
I wouldn't have expected it to happen that quickly.
Yeah, so we're talking about a really rapid change here.
That's fascinating.
And what's especially interesting is this study focused specifically on healthy young men.
Uh-huh.
So we're not talking about individuals who are already overweight or dealing with any sort of, metabolic issues.
Right. So this is a population that you would generally assume to be pretty resilient.
Exactly.
Yeah. Makes you think.
So maybe we could break this down a little bit.
Sure.
When we talk about reduced insulin sensitivity in the brain, what does that actually mean?
So think of it this way. Insulin is like a key that unlocks the door for sugar to enter the cells.
Right. It helps your body use that sugar for energy.
Exactly. And when the brain becomes less sensitive to insulin, it's kind of like that key isn't working as well. The door doesn't open as easily. So the brain has to work harder to get the energy it needs.
Wow. I never thought about it like that before.
Yeah. And you can imagine how that could lead to a cascade of problems. Like difficulty concentrating, maybe some memory issues.
Oh, interesting.
Even mood swings could be linked to this.
Wow. So it's not just about physical health.
No, not at all.
It really affects how we think and feel as well.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes this study so significant.
Okay.
It highlights the brain as this kind of central control center for metabolism, not just something that's passively affected by it.
So let's dig a little deeper into the study itself. Can you walk me through what they actually did?
Sure. So they took 29 healthy weight men, all in their 20s,
Okay.
and they split them into 2 groups. One group was the control group,
Got it.
and they just continued eating their normal diet for 5 days. The other group, though, they had their regular diet, plus they got an extra 1,500 calories of junk food every day.
1,500.
Yeah.
That's a lot of extra calories.
Yeah, it's definitely a significant increase.
So I'm curious, what kind of junk food are we talking about here? Was it specifically defined in the study?
Oh, yeah, they were pretty specific. Think, the usual suspects.
Okay.
Pizza, burgers, fries.
Yep. Classics.
Lots of sugary drinks, too.
Okay.
Basically all those highly processed, calorie-dense foods that, let's face it, most of us find so tempting.
Yeah, definitely guilty of indulging in those from time to time.
Don't worry, we all do.
So after 5 days of this dietary intervention, what did they find?
Well, they used MRI scans to look at changes in the participants' livers and brains.
Interesting.
And the results were pretty striking.
Okay.
As you might expect, the group that ate all that junk food, they showed an increase in liver fat.
Right, that makes sense.
But here's the really interesting part. They also showed this reduced insulin sensitivity in their brains.
So even after just 5 days, their brains were already starting to struggle with processing sugar effectively.
Exactly.
Wow.
And get this effect persisted even after a week of going back to their normal diets.
So even after they stopped eating the junk food, their brains were still kind of stuck in that less efficient mode.
That's right. It's as though their brains had adapted to this sudden influx of excess calories. And then they had trouble switching gears when those extra calories weren't there anymore.
That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, and for me, I think what was most surprising was just how quickly these changes happened.
5 days is not a lot of time.
Nope.
And the fact that these effects lingered even after they went back to their regular eating habits,
Right.
it really underscores the point that even short-term indulgences can have consequences that stick around for a while.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Really makes you question those choices we make, especially when we're stressed or tempted. So, we've seen that even just a few days of indulging in junk food can have a pretty significant impact on the brain's ability to process sugar effectively.
Right.
But what's the underlying reason for this? Why would our brains react this way to, what we eat?
That's a great question, and it takes us back to our evolutionary history.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Imagine our ancestors living in a time when food was scarce and unpredictable.
Right, feast or famine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when they did manage to find calorie-rich food,
Mm,
their brains likely evolved to become super efficient at storing that energy.
makes sense. It would have been a survival mechanism.
Exactly. A way to help them get through those lean times when food was hard to come by.
So basically, our brains are still wired to take advantage of those rare feasts,
Right.
even though for many of us today, it's more like a constant buffet situation.
You got it. And that's where the problem lies.
Yeah.
Our modern world is overflowing with easily accessible, highly processed, calorie-dense foods.
Yeah, it's everywhere we look.
And that ancient feast or famine adaptation
Yeah.
that served our ancestors so well.
Right.
It might be backfiring in this context.
Interesting.
It could be a major contributor to the rising rates of obesity and all the related health issues we see today.
So it's like our brains haven't quite caught up to the fact that we're not living in the Stone Age anymore.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
We're surrounded by temptation.
And our brains are still wired to go after those calorie-dense foods.
Even though we don't really need them for survival anymore.
Right.
It's fascinating to think about the brain as this control center for metabolism and weight regulation.
Absolutely.
It's not just about willpower or making good choices. There's this whole complex biological process at play.
Yeah, and this study really drives home how important it is to understand that complexity.
Yeah.
It's not just about what we eat.
Uh-huh.
It's also about how our brains respond to those choices, both in the short term and over time.
It's a whole new way of looking at our relationship with food.
I think so too.
And it makes you wonder, if these changes can happen so quickly,
Right.
what happens when those short-term indulgences become more frequent, like a regular part of our diet?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
And while this particular study didn't delve into those long-term effects,
Right.
it definitely raises some red flags.
Yeah, it makes you think twice about those harmless treats we reach for so often.
Definitely.
So, this reduced brain insulin sensitivity that they observed in the study,
Uh-huh.
it actually mirrors what we see in individuals who are dealing with obesity and type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant connection.
So are you suggesting that even these brief periods of overindulging in junk food could
Yes.
potentially contribute to the development of those more serious conditions down the line?
It's definitely a possibility. Now, it's important to note that this study doesn't definitively prove a cause and effect relationship,
Sure.
but it does provide some compelling evidence to suggest that there's a strong connection there.
So it's a piece of the puzzle, for sure.
Exactly.
Okay, but why? Why would our brains react this way to junk food?
Right.
It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Well, like we talked about earlier, our evolutionary past might hold the key to understanding this.
Okay, so let's go back to that.
Our ancestors needed to be able to quickly store energy when food was available.
Mm-hmm.
So their brains might have developed this kind of heightened sensitivity to calorie-dense foods,
Okay.
which was great for survival back then.
Yeah, but maybe not so great for us today.
Exactly. Our environment has changed dramatically, but our brains haven't quite caught up. So we're left with these ancient instincts driving us towards foods that are readily available, but not necessarily good for us.
It's like a mismatch between our biology and our modern world.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
So this constant overload of easily accessible calories could be a major factor driving those changes in brain function that we've been discussing,
I think that's a very plausible explanation.
affecting things like insulin sensitivity, our ability to regulate our appetite. It's
Exactly.
all connected.
It is.
This whole idea of the brain being a control center for metabolism and weight regulation is just fascinating.
It really is.
It's not as simple as just making good choices. There's this whole intricate biological system at work.
And I think this study really emphasizes how important it is to understand that complexity.
Yeah.
It's not just about what we eat, but about how our brains respond to those dietary choices, both in the short term and over the long haul.
So it's a reminder that we need to be mindful of what we put into our bodies
Absolutely.
because it has a profound impact on how our brains function and ultimately our overall health.
I couldn't agree more.
It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
enjoying those treats occasionally, but also making choices that support our brain health in the long run.
Right. It's about creating a sustainable lifestyle that works for you.
I like that.
And that includes being aware of those evolutionary drives that might be influencing our food choices.
So we can make informed decisions that align with our health goals.
Exactly.
So knowing all of this, how do we navigate those moments when we're feeling stressed or tempted? Those times when we just crave those less healthy options.
That's where understanding those evolutionary drives we were talking about can be really helpful.
Okay, I'm listening.
If we know that our brains are kind of hardwired to crave those high-calorie foods, we can start to anticipate those cravings and come up with strategies to deal with them.
So what kind of strategies are we talking about?
Well, it could be something as simple as having healthier snacks readily available.
Okay, so instead of reaching for that bag of chips,
Right.
maybe having a bowl of fruit on the counter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or pre-cut veggies in the fridge.
So it's about being prepared.
Yeah, having those healthier options front and center.
Makes them more appealing.
And maybe it's about finding ways to manage stress that don't involve turning to food.
That's a good point.
Things like exercise, meditation, spending time in nature.
Yeah, connecting with loved ones.
Absolutely. Those can all be powerful tools for regulating our moods.
And potentially reducing those urges to overindulge.
Right. It's about finding what works for you.
I like that approach.
It's about empowering ourselves to make choices that support both our physical and mental well-being.
So being proactive and having a plan in place before those cravings hit.
Exactly.
Instead of just reacting in the moment.
It's all about being in control.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation.
I've enjoyed it.
So let's take a moment to recap what we've learned today about junk food and its impact on the brain.
Sure.
We've discovered that even short-term junk food binges can have a real impact on our brain function.
Right.
Specifically, reducing insulin sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
And those changes can linger even after we return to a healthier diet.
Exactly. They don't just disappear overnight.
We've also explored how this might be linked to our evolutionary past.
Our ancient survival mechanisms.
Right.
That might be working against us in our modern food environment.
And how this constant overload of easily accessible calories could be contributing to those changes in brain function.
It's a complex interplay of factors, for sure.
But we've also talked about strategies for navigating this challenge.
Right.
Being mindful of our cravings. And finding ways to support our brain health through healthier choices and lifestyle changes.
It's about taking control of our health, one step at a time.
And it's not about perfection, it's about progress.
Couldn't agree more.
Making those small, sustainable changes that add up over time.
Exactly.
So this leads us to a final thought-provoking question for you to consider.
I'm intrigued.
Knowing all of this, how might you rethink your relationship with food? What small changes can you make, maybe even starting today, to support your brain health in the long run?
That's a great question to ponder.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Absolutely.
And every step towards a healthier lifestyle is a win.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's about making choices that nourish both our bodies and our minds.
I think that's a great note to end on.
So, until next time, be kind to your brain.
And make those healthy choices.
We'll see you soon.
Take care.
Makes you wonder what might happen if those short-term indulgences become, more frequent, like a regular thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, what if those 5 days turn into 5 weeks? Or even 5 months?
Right. What happens then?
It's a crucial question. And while this particular study didn't explore the long-term effects, it definitely raises some concerns, especially when we consider that this reduced brain insulin sensitivity they observed. It kind of mirrors what we see in folks dealing with obesity and type 2 diabetes.
So you're suggesting that even those brief periods of overindulging, they could potentially be setting the stage for those more serious conditions down the line?
Well, it's certainly a possibility. This study doesn't definitively prove that, of course.
Of course.
But it does offer some pretty compelling evidence to suggest there's a link there.
Okay, so we can't say for sure, but it's definitely worth paying attention to.
Absolutely.
All right, but why? Why would our brains react this way to junk food?
Right. It seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. You'd think our bodies would be like, hey, too much of a good thing. Time to slow down.
Well, there's actually a pretty fascinating evolutionary explanation for this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So imagine our ancestors, way back when food was scarce and unpredictable.
Right, the whole feast or famine thing.
Exactly. When they did come across calorie-rich food,
Uh-huh.
their brains needed to be super efficient at storing that energy.
Yeah, it was a survival mechanism.
Right, a way to make sure they could get through those lean times when the food was harder to find.
So basically, we're still carrying around those ancient instincts.
Yeah, like deep down, our brains are still programmed to capitalize on those rare feasts.
Even though nowadays, for many of us, it's more like a 24/7 all-you-can-eat buffet.
Haha, exactly. And that's where the problem lies.
Uh,
Our modern world is overflowing with readily available, highly processed, calorie-dense foods.
Temptation at every corner.
Right. And that ancient feast or famine adaptation that served our ancestors so well,
Yeah.
it might actually be working against us in this context.
So, like, our brains haven't quite caught up to the fact that we're not living in the Stone Age anymore.
You got it.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by all this easily accessible, calorie-rich food.
But our brains are still wired to go after it like it's a rare and precious resource.
Exactly. And that constant overload of calories could be a major factor driving those changes in brain function.
Affecting things like insulin sensitivity.
Right, and maybe even our ability to regulate our appetite, how we experience those feelings of fullness and satisfaction.
It's kind of like our brains are stuck in overdrive.
Yeah, constantly telling us to eat more, even when we don't need to.
I'm really fascinated by this whole idea of the brain being this control center for metabolism and weight regulation.
Yeah, it's a really important shift in how we think about these things.
It's not just about willpower or making good choices.
Right, it's way more complex than that.
There's this whole intricate biological system at play.
Absolutely. And this study really highlights how crucial it is to understand that complexity.
Yeah.
It's not just about what we eat, but about how our brains respond to those choices.
It's a two-way street.
Right, both in the short term and over the long term.
This really is a whole new way of looking at our relationship with food.
It changes the whole conversation, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you realize that there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And the more we understand about those underlying mechanisms, the better equipped we'll be to make healthy choices.
Choices that support both our physical and mental well-being.
Exactly. It's all connected.
Yeah, it really makes you stop and think about those harmless indulgences we all reach for sometimes.
Absolutely. I mean, we've all been there, right? That late night pizza craving or reaching for the cookie jar after a stressful day.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I think it's important to remember that it's not about denying ourselves those pleasures altogether. It's not about being perfect.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah, it's about becoming more aware of the potential impact even those short-term choices can have on our brain health and our overall well-being.
Okay, so knowing all of this, how do we navigate that? Especially in those moments when we're feeling, stressed or tempted.
Well, I think this is where understanding those evolutionary drives we were talking about can be really helpful.
Okay.
If we know that our brains are wired to crave those high-calorie foods, we can kind of anticipate those cravings and come up with strategies to deal with them.
So what kind of strategies are we talking about? Like, what can we actually do?
Well, it could be as simple as having healthier snacks readily available.
So instead of reaching for that bag of chips,
Yeah, exactly.
maybe having a bowl of fruit on the counter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or pre-cut veggies in the fridge.
Yeah, making it easy to grab something healthy.
Right. Having those healthier options front and center makes them more appealing, more likely to choose them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And maybe it's about finding ways to manage stress that don't involve turning to food.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point.
Things like exercise, meditation, spending time in nature.
Right, connecting with loved ones.
Exactly. All of those things can be powerful tools for regulating our moods and potentially reducing those urges to overindulge.
It's like finding healthy outlets for those feelings instead of just numbing them with food.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
So I really like that approach, being proactive and having a plan in place before those cravings hit.
Absolutely. Instead of just reacting in the moment.
Yeah, it's about being in control.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this has been a really enlightening conversation.
I've enjoyed it too.
So let's take a moment to recap what we've learned from this deep dive into how junk food affects our brains.
Sounds good.
We've discovered that even short-term junk food binges can have a real impact on our brain function, specifically reducing insulin sensitivity.
Right. And remember, those changes can linger even after we return to a healthier diet.
They don't just disappear overnight.
Nope. It takes time for our brains to readjust.
We've also explored how this might be linked to our evolutionary past, those ancient survival mechanisms that may be working against us in our modern food environment.
Right, like a mismatch between our biology and the world we live in now.
And how this constant overload of easily accessible calories could be a major factor driving those changes in brain function.
It's a complex interplay of factors, for sure.
But we've also talked about strategies for navigating this challenge, being mindful of our cravings, and finding ways to support our brain health through healthier choices and lifestyle changes.
Absolutely. It's about empowering ourselves to take control of our health one step at a time.
And it's not about perfection, it's about progress, making those small, sustainable changes that add up over time.
Couldn't agree more.
So this leads us to a final, thought-provoking question for you to consider.
Okay, I'm listening.
Knowing all of this, how might you rethink your relationship with food? What small changes can you make, maybe even starting today, to support your brain health in the long run?
It's a great question to leave our listeners with.
It's a journey, not a destination, and every step towards a healthier lifestyle is a win.
Absolutely. It's all about progress, not perfection.
So until next time, be kind to your brain and make those healthy choices.
Take care, everyone.